Good evening. Tonight, we leave behind the noise of busy cities, crowded streets, and the constant movement of modern life. Instead, we travel to one of the loneliest places in the North Atlantic, a place where enormous cliffs rise straight from the sea, where thousands of seabirds circle overhead, where the wind rarely grows quiet, and where the sound of the ocean never truly stops. Far beyond the western coast of Scotland lies a small chain of islands known as the Flannan Isles. Even today, reaching these islands is not easy. The weather changes quickly. The sea is often rough. Powerful waves crash endlessly against dark stone cliffs that have stood for countless centuries. Most travelers never see these islands. Most sailors pass them from a safe distance. Yet more than 100 years ago, this lonely place became the setting for one of history's most enduring maritime mysteries. 3 lighthouse keepers, one isolated lighthouse, no signs of violence, no confirmed witnesses, no final explanation, only silence. Our story begins long before the disappearance itself, because to understand the mystery, we must first understand the place. The Flannan Isles are made up of 7 small islands scattered across the Atlantic Ocean. They are beautiful in a quiet, rugged way. There are no towns, no permanent villages, no roads winding across the hills, only steep cliffs covered with grass, dark volcanic rock, and the endless sea stretching toward the horizon. For centuries, fishermen occasionally landed here during calm weather. Sometimes shepherds brought sheep to graze during the warmer months before returning to the mainland. But very few people stayed for long. The islands were simply too remote, the weather too unpredictable, the sea too powerful. Standing on the cliffs, a person could look westward across thousands of miles of open Atlantic. There would be nothing between those islands and the distant shores of North America except water. Day after day, night after night, only waves, only wind, only sky. Life in such a place demanded patience. It demanded respect. No one could hurry the sea. No one could command the weather. Every decision depended upon nature. Long before modern navigation, sailors crossing these waters relied on experience and careful observation. Hidden rocks waited just beneath the surface. Heavy fog could arrive without warning. Winter storms often reduced visibility until the coastline disappeared completely. Many ships never reached their destinations. Some struck submerged reefs. Others vanished beneath enormous waves generated by Atlantic storms. Each accident reminded sailors how dangerous these waters could become. During the 19th century, sea traffic steadily increased. Merchant ships carried coal, timber, food, machinery, and countless other goods between Britain and distant ports. Fishing fleets worked the surrounding waters throughout the seasons. The number of vessels passing near the Flannan Isles continued to grow. So did concern for their safety. Officials responsible for Scotland's lighthouses studied the coastline carefully. They identified dangerous locations where new lights could prevent future disasters. The Flannan Isles quickly became one of the highest priorities. Building a lighthouse there would not be simple. Every stone, every beam of timber, every piece of iron, every sheet of glass, everything had to arrive by boat. Landing supplies on the islands proved difficult. The cliffs offered very few places where cargo could be safely unloaded. Workers constructed a small landing area before beginning the larger project. Heavy cranes lifted equipment from boats below onto the rocky shore. Strong ropes secured every load. Even calm weather required great care. A single unexpected wave could sweep valuable materials back into the sea. Construction continued slowly throughout the late 1990s. Despite frequent storms and difficult working conditions, the lighthouse gradually took shape. The tower rose proudly above the cliffs. Built from strong stone, it stood ready to face the harsh Atlantic climate. Nearby, a comfortable residence was completed for the lighthouse keepers. Although simple by modern standards, the living quarters contained everything necessary for long periods of isolation. Bedrooms, a kitchen, storage rooms, workshops, fresh water tanks, coal for heating, food supplies carefully organized. Every detail mattered. The nearest permanent communities lay many miles away across open water. Once storms arrived, the keepers might remain completely isolated for weeks. Everything they needed had to be prepared in advance. Finally, in December of 1899, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse entered service. As darkness fell each evening, its powerful light swept across the ocean. Visible from many miles away, the beacon guided ships safely around the dangerous coastline. To passing sailors, that light offered comfort. It meant someone was watching, someone was keeping the lamp burning, someone was awake while others slept. Few sailors ever thought about the people inside the lighthouse. Yet keeping that light operating demanded constant work. Every day followed a careful routine. The large oil lamp required cleaning. Its glass had to remain perfectly clear. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the light needed winding at regular intervals. Fuel levels were checked, weather observations recorded, windows cleaned, machinery inspected, surrounding buildings maintained. Nothing could be neglected. Even a small mechanical problem might place countless ships at risk. Life moved slowly. Morning began with inspections. Meals were prepared together. Repairs filled much of the afternoon. As sunset approached, attention shifted toward preparing the great lantern for another night. When darkness finally arrived, the lighthouse came alive. Its bright beam rotated steadily across the Atlantic until dawn. The routine rarely changed. Days blended into weeks. Weeks blended into months. The sea determined everything. Some mornings began beneath brilliant blue skies. Others opened with thick fog covering every cliff. Winter storms occasionally trapped the keepers indoors, while enormous waves crashed far below. The wind screamed across the island with astonishing force. Windows rattled, doors shook. Yet inside the lighthouse, life continued according to schedule. Discipline became essential. The lighthouse service carefully selected experienced men for such assignments. The work demanded responsibility, patience, and emotional stability. Anyone unable to tolerate loneliness would quickly struggle. Months spent on isolated islands tested even the strongest personalities. Still, many lighthouse keepers considered the profession honorable. Their work protected lives. Every ship safely passing through dangerous waters represented another successful night. As the year 2000 slowly approached its final weeks, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse appeared to be functioning exactly as intended.
The machinery worked perfectly. Supply boats arrived according to schedule. The keepers carried out their duties with professionalism. Nothing in the official records suggested that anything unusual was happening. No warnings, no strange reports, no signs of trouble. Everything seemed calm. Everything seemed ordinary. And perhaps that is what makes the mystery so enduring. Because history often announces great events with obvious warning signs. This story did not. It began with ordinary days, ordinary routines, 3 ordinary men quietly doing an extraordinary job on one of the loneliest islands in the world. No one, not...
By the winter of 1900, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse had become a familiar sight to sailors crossing the waters west of Scotland. Night after night, its bright white beams swept steadily across the Atlantic. For captains navigating through darkness, the lighthouse represented certainty. No matter how rough the sea became, they expected to see that familiar light waiting for them. Few ever wondered about the men responsible for keeping it alive. Inside the lighthouse lived 3 experienced keepers. Each had spent years working along dangerous coastlines. They understood storms. They understood isolation. And perhaps most importantly, they understood responsibility. Every evening before the sun disappeared beneath the horizon, preparations quietly began. The lantern room at the top of the tower required careful attention. The enormous glass lenses had to remain perfectly clean. Even a thin layer of dust or salt could reduce the strength of the light. The keepers polished each piece of glass with remarkable care. The oil reservoirs were checked, the burners inspected. The clockwork mechanism that rotated the great lens had to be wound by hand, much like an enormous clock. Nothing was left to chance. Once darkness arrived, the beacon would continue shining throughout the night. Failure was simply not acceptable. The lighthouse stood nearly 75 feet above the rocky ground below. From the lantern room, the keepers could see an endless horizon stretching across the Atlantic. On clear evenings, the ocean seemed almost peaceful. Gentle waves reflected the fading light of sunset. Seabirds glided effortlessly above the cliffs before settling for the night. It was a beautiful place, but beauty often existed alongside danger. Within only a few hours, calm skies could disappear beneath heavy clouds. Powerful winds could arrive without warning. The Atlantic was famous for changing its mood quickly. Every keeper respected that reality. Their daily schedule followed a steady rhythm. Morning usually began with weather observations, cloud cover, wind direction, sea conditions, air pressure. Every detail was carefully recorded. These notes became part of the official lighthouse log. Later, inspections were carried out across the station. Doors, windows, storage rooms, coal supplies, fresh water. Everything had to remain in excellent condition. Even the smallest repair received attention before it became a larger problem. Meals were simple but filling. Fresh bread arrived whenever supply boats visited. Salted meat lasted for long periods. Oatmeal, potatoes, tea, and preserved foods formed much of the daily diet. Cooking duties were shared among the men. Life on such an isolated island encouraged cooperation. There were no restaurants, no shops, no neighbors to visit. The 3 keepers depended upon one another for both practical work and companionship. Conversations often filled the quiet evenings before sunset. They discussed weather, ships spotted on the horizon, news remembered from the mainland, family members waiting at home.
Small stories became valuable when surrounded by endless ocean. Books also played an important role. Many lighthouse keepers enjoyed reading during quiet hours. Religious texts, adventure novels, newspapers delivered weeks earlier. Anything helped pass the long evenings. Some men wrote letters whenever supply boats were expected. Others kept personal journals describing daily life on the island. The silence encouraged reflection, yet loneliness remained an unavoidable part of the profession. Weeks sometimes passed without seeing another human being beyond the small group living together. When storms arrived, even supply boats stayed away. The lighthouse became an island within an island, completely surrounded by restless water. Still, experienced keepers accepted this way of life. The sea had always demanded sacrifice. The men serving at Flannan knew exactly what they had chosen. The lighthouse service organized its staff carefully. Normally, 3 men lived on the island while a 4th keeper remained on leave. After several weeks, 1 man returned to the mainland and another arrived to replace him. This rotating schedule allowed each keeper time with family before returning once again to the remote station. By December of 1900, the 3 men assigned to Flannan were James Ducat, second assistant Thomas Marshall, and occasional keeper Donald MacArthur. Each brought different experiences to the island. James Ducat had earned a reputation as a dependable and disciplined lighthouse keeper. He believed strongly in routine. Everything had its proper place. Every task had its proper time. His careful approach helped ensure the lighthouse operated smoothly. Thomas Marshall also possessed considerable experience. Before joining the lighthouse service, he had spent years at sea. He understood storms better than most people ever would. His weather observations were respected for their accuracy. He appreciated how quickly conditions could change across the North Atlantic. Donald MacArthur's presence was slightly unusual. He served as a relief keeper rather than a permanent member of the station. Strong and physically capable, he had accepted temporary duty while another keeper remained on leave. Friends described him as hard-working, though sometimes outspoken. Like the others, however, he understood the importance of the work. Together, they formed a small community. Every decision affected everyone. Trust became essential. Far from the mainland, there was no one else to rely upon. During the first weeks of December, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Supply boats arrived as scheduled, routine maintenance continued, the lighthouse functioned normally. Passing ships reported seeing the beacon shining brightly each evening. Official records revealed nothing unusual. If anyone had visited the island during those quiet days, they would have found 3 men carrying out familiar responsibilities: cleaning, cooking, writing reports, watching the weather, preparing another night of safe navigation for countless strangers sailing beyond the horizon. As Christmas slowly approached, winter tightened its grip across the North Atlantic. Days grew shorter. Darkness arrived earlier each afternoon. Storms became more frequent. The sea took on a deeper shade of gray. Powerful waves struck the cliffs with tremendous force. Yet such conditions were expected during December. Experienced lighthouse keepers had faced many difficult winters before. No one considered rough weather unusual. Life continued much as it always had. Each evening the great lantern awakened. Its steady beam swept silently across the ocean. Ships passed safely through the darkness. Far below, waves crashed endlessly against ancient rocks. Inside the warm stone building, 3 men quietly completed another ordinary day. Nothing in their conversations, nothing in their reports, nothing in the routine suggested that history was already moving toward one of its greatest maritime mysteries. Soon the weather would begin to change, and with it, the peaceful rhythm of life on the Flannan Isles would quietly come to an end.
During the middle of December in the year 1900, winter settled firmly across the North Atlantic. The days became remarkably short. Sunrise arrived late. Darkness returned early. For the lighthouse keepers on the Flannan Isles, this meant longer nights tending the great lantern that guided ships safely through dangerous waters. The rhythm of life remained steady. Each morning began with familiar routines. The weather was observed, the lamp was inspected, equipment was cleaned, meals were prepared. The stone buildings echoed with ordinary conversations. Outside, the Atlantic continued its endless conversation with the cliffs below. Everything appeared normal. At least that is what the surviving records suggest. No visitor arrived to report unusual behavior. No letters hinted at growing concern. No official documents described conflict among the three men. The lighthouse station functioned exactly as it had been designed to function: reliable, organized, quiet. The final days before the mystery would later seem almost peaceful. Yet historians know that appearances can sometimes be misleading. Far beyond the islands, ships crossing the Atlantic began encountering increasingly difficult weather. December storms were nothing new. Experienced captains expected them every winter. But every storm was different. Some passed quickly. Others lingered for days, driving enormous waves toward the rocky coastline of Scotland. The Flannan Isles stood directly in the path of many Atlantic weather systems. When powerful winds arrived, there was nowhere to hide. The cliffs absorbed the full force of the sea. Spray exploded high into the air. Foam covered the rocks. The wind howled around the lighthouse tower with astonishing strength. Inside the lighthouse, however, life remained surprisingly comfortable. The thick stone walls protected the keepers from much of the weather outside. Coal fires warmed the living quarters. Windows overlooked the sea while sheltering those inside. Even during fierce storms, experienced keepers continued their duties calmly. They had prepared for exactly this kind of environment. Storms were part of the job. Fear had little place in their routine. Each evening before sunset, one of the most important tasks began. The great Fresnel lens inside the lantern room required careful attention. This remarkable piece of engineering concentrated the light into a powerful beam visible for many miles. Every glass surface had to remain spotless. Dust, salt, moisture, any of these could reduce visibility for distant ships. The keepers polished the lens patiently, often spending considerable time ensuring every section gleamed perfectly. Once the lamp was lit, the mechanism slowly rotated throughout the night. The beam swept gracefully across the sea in regular intervals. To sailors watching from far away, it appeared almost effortless. Only the keepers knew how much work supported that quiet light. Meanwhile, life beyond the lighthouse continued. Fishing boats departed nearby harbors whenever weather allowed. Merchant vessels carried cargo between Britain and North America. Steamships crossed the Atlantic on demanding schedules. Every captain relied upon accurate navigation. Every lighthouse formed one important link in a chain stretching along the coastline. When one light failed, uncertainty followed. For that reason, lighthouse authorities monitored stations carefully. Supply ships traveled according to regular schedules whenever weather permitted. Reports were submitted, equipment inspected. Nothing was left entirely to chance. On the evening of December 15th, according to later reports from passing vessels, something unusual may have happened. One ship sailing through the area reportedly failed to see the lighthouse beam. The captain noted its absence. At first, this may not have seemed alarming. Heavy rain,
dense mist or unusually poor visibility could sometimes hide even the brightest lighthouse. Sailors understood this possibility. Still, the missing light quietly entered the historical record. Whether it represented the first sign of trouble remains uncertain. Historians continued debating exactly what happened that evening. The evidence is incomplete. Some records were written days later. Others relied on memory rather than immediate observation. As with many historical mysteries, certainty remains difficult. Yet the reports suggest that sometime during those final days, the normal rhythm of the lighthouse may already have been changing. Back on the island, no surviving document describes those final hours. The official logbook would eventually become one of the most carefully examined pieces of evidence. But even it leaves important questions unanswered. There are no dramatic final entries, no desperate warnings, no mysterious coded messages, only routine observations, weather, maintenance, daily work. Nothing that clearly predicted the events about to unfold. Imagine the three keepers sharing supper inside the warm stone residence. Outside, waves crash endlessly against the cliffs. The wind whistles softly around the windows. Coal burns steadily in the fireplace. Perhaps they discuss family waiting on the mainland. Perhaps they speak about Christmas, now only days away. Perhaps they simply enjoy the quiet after another day of work. No one can know those conversations now. History preserved almost none of them. And perhaps that silence makes the mystery feel even more personal. The keepers were not famous explorers. They were not military commanders. They were ordinary working men performing an essential public service. Their lives followed predictable routines. Their responsibilities were clear. Everything about their daily existence suggested stability. Nothing suggested that they were approaching the final chapter anyone would ever witness. As darkness covered the Atlantic once again, the lighthouse should have continued its faithful work. Its beam should have swept across the sea, hour after hour. Ships should have seen it from miles away. The three keepers should have completed another ordinary shift before greeting the next morning together. That is what was expected. That is what had always happened. But sometime during those cold December days, something interrupted that routine. Not dramatically, not with witnesses watching nearby, only quietly, on one of the most isolated islands in Britain, far from cities, far from newspapers, far from anyone who might have understood what was happening. Days would pass before another person reached the island, and when they finally arrived, they would discover a lighthouse still standing proudly above the sea, but its keepers nowhere to be found. On the morning of December 26th, 1900, Christmas had already passed across much of Scotland. Families gathered around warm fireplaces. Children enjoyed the final days of the holiday season. Harbors slowly returned to their ordinary routines after several days of difficult weather. Far out in the Atlantic, however, the Flannan Isles remained quiet. The lighthouse still stood on its lonely cliff, facing the endless sea. From the mainland, no one yet knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The relief vessel assigned to the lighthouse was called the Hesperus. Its task was simple: deliver fresh supplies, bring a replacement keeper, collect one of the men whose period of service had ended. The voyage followed a familiar schedule that had already been repeated many times. Normally, the lighthouse keepers would be waiting near the landing platform. As soon as the ship appeared on the horizon, one of the men usually climbed down towards the small dock. Signals would be exchanged, cargo would be unloaded, mail would change hands. Fresh newspapers often arrived, letters from family members, food, coal, equipment. The visit rarely lasted very long. Then the Hesperus would continue its journey.
Captain James Harvey had completed similar trips before. He knew the islands well. He understood that weather sometimes delayed arrivals. In fact, strong winter storms had already forced the Hesperus to postpone this particular voyage for several days. Nothing about that seemed unusual. The Atlantic often decided its own schedule. As the ship finally approached the Flannan Isles, the weather had improved considerably. The sea still rolled beneath the vessel, but conditions were calm enough for a safe landing. The great stone lighthouse soon appeared above the cliffs. From a distance, everything looked perfectly ordinary. The tower stood exactly where it always had. No visible damage marked the buildings. No smoke suggested fire. No obvious signs of disaster could be seen. Yet something immediately caught Captain Harvey's attention. There was no welcome. Normally, one of the keepers would already be standing near the landing platform. Sometimes they waved. Sometimes they prepared ropes for unloading supplies. This morning, no one appeared. Captain Harvey waited. Still nothing. The ship sounded its horn. The deep blast echoed across the cliffs before disappearing into the open sea. Silence answered. Again the horn sounded. Again, no movement came from the lighthouse. Captain Harvey fired a signal rocket into the sky. Bright light briefly flashed above the island before fading into the morning air. Still, no response. No figure emerged from the buildings. No one waved from the tower. No door opened. The island remained strangely quiet. Those aboard the Hesperus began exchanging uncertain glances. Perhaps the keepers had simply failed to hear the signals. Perhaps they were busy elsewhere. There had to be some ordinary explanation. After waiting several more minutes, Captain Harvey made his decision. Someone would have to go ashore. The responsibility fell to Joseph Moore, the relief keeper. He had expected to replace one of the men already stationed on the island. Instead, he now found himself climbing into a small boat under unusual circumstances. The journey from the ship to the landing platform was never easy. Even in calm weather, waves pushed constantly against the rocks. Careful timing was essential. Moore climbed the steep stone steps leading towards the lighthouse. As he reached higher ground, an uncomfortable feeling slowly settled over him. Everything seemed still, too still. Normally, signs of daily life would have been obvious. Voices, footsteps, the sound of a door opening, perhaps even laughter carried by the wind. Instead, only the ocean could be heard. The path leading towards the lighthouse appeared empty. Grass moved gently beneath the winter breeze. Seabirds circled high above the cliffs. Nothing else stirred. Moore continued walking. The buildings came into clearer view. The main entrance stood closed. He knocked firmly. No answer. He called out. Only silence returned. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Carefully, he opened the door. Inside, the lighthouse residence appeared strangely ordinary. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing indicated violence. The kitchen looked neat. Furniture remained in place. Beds had been slept in. There were no signs of struggle. Yet there was also no one there. The rooms were empty, completely empty. Moore searched each room carefully. Bedrooms, storage areas, the kitchen. Nothing. No lighthouse keepers, only the quiet presence of an abandoned building. As he looked around more closely, several small details began attracting his attention. One chair had been slightly pulled away from the table. A meal appeared to have been interrupted. Some reports later suggested that kitchen utensils remained where they last had been used.
Other details became difficult to confirm with certainty over the years. Historians continued debating exactly what Moore first observed. Some popular stories added dramatic details that never appeared in the earliest official reports. Separating fact from legend would later become one of the greatest challenges of studying the case. One fact, however, remained beyond dispute. The 3 keepers were gone. Moore climbed the lighthouse tower. The lantern itself appeared well maintained. The light had been extinguished as expected during daylight hours. Nothing seemed damaged. The machinery remained largely intact. Everything suggested that the keepers had continued their duties normally until something happened. Outside, Moore carefully inspected the surrounding grounds. Again, there were no obvious answers. No footprints remained. Winter weather had erased any temporary marks long before the Hesperus arrived. The cliffs overlooked an ocean that appeared calm now, but everyone knew how violent it could become. Moore returned to the landing platform and signaled towards the waiting ship. The message was simple. Something was terribly wrong. Captain Harvey soon came ashore himself. Together, the men searched the station once more. Every room, every building, every path. Nothing. No trace of James Ducat, no sign of Thomas Marshall, no evidence explaining where Donald MacArthur had gone. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had somehow vanished from one of the most isolated locations in Scotland. The lighthouse remained. Their belongings remained, but the men themselves had disappeared.
News of the missing lighthouse keepers did not spread across Britain immediately. In the winter of 1900, information traveled much more slowly than it does today. There were no television broadcasts, no radio reports, no instant messages carried across the world in seconds. Instead, official reports were written by hand, delivered to government offices, and carefully reviewed before newspapers learned of the story. At first, the disappearance was treated as a serious workplace incident. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had failed to report for duty. That alone demanded an investigation. The Northern Lighthouse Board, responsible for maintaining Scotland's lighthouses, wasted little time. Every lighthouse represented an essential part of maritime safety. If something dangerous had happened on the Flannan Isles, officials needed answers. The responsibility for leading the investigation soon fell to Robert Muirhead. He was an experienced superintendent who understood lighthouse operations better than most people. Unlike newspaper reporters searching for dramatic headlines, Muirhead approached the mystery with patience and discipline. His task was simple in theory: visit the island, study every detail, determine what most likely happened. In practice, however, the task proved far more difficult. By the time Muirhead reached the Flannan Isles, valuable evidence had already been disturbed. The relief keeper had naturally resumed operation of the lighthouse. Rooms had been entered, doors opened, supplies moved. Nothing improper had occurred. Maintaining the lighthouse remained the highest priority. Still, investigators knew that every passing day made reconstruction more difficult. The weather itself also continued changing. Rain washed over the cliffs. Powerful winds swept across the island. Any footprints or temporary signs had disappeared long before investigators arrived. Nature quietly erased many possible clues. Even so, Muirhead began examining everything he could. The living quarters appeared orderly. Beds were neatly arranged. Personal belongings remained inside the residence. Clothing hung where it had been left. Nothing suggested that the men had packed for a journey. No evidence indicated they intended to abandon their duties voluntarily. The kitchen also appeared surprisingly normal. Meals had been prepared. Daily life seemed to continue without interruption. There were no signs of panic, no broken furniture, no blood, no indication of violence. The lighthouse itself remained in excellent condition. The great lantern functioned perfectly. The clockwork mechanism showed no obvious damage. The light clearly had been maintained until shortly before the disappearance. This detail puzzled investigators. Experienced lighthouse keepers understood their responsibilities completely. Leaving the station unattended without extraordinary reason would have violated every rule of the service. Something significant must have happened. But what? Muirhead next turned his attention outdoors. The western landing place immediately attracted interest. This side of the island faced directly toward the open Atlantic. Under calm conditions, it already presented challenges. During storms, it became one of the most dangerous places on the island. As investigators studied the area, they noticed signs of storm damage. Equipment normally stored near the landing platform had been displaced. A supply box appeared damaged. Iron railings showed evidence of heavy impact. Ropes had been moved from their usual positions. These observations suggested that enormous waves had reached heights far beyond ordinary expectations. The Atlantic was certainly capable of producing such conditions. Winter storms regularly generated tremendous seas. Yet experienced lighthouse keepers understood these dangers better than anyone. They would not casually expose themselves to unnecessary risk. Muirhead continued recording every observation carefully. Nothing ignored, nothing assumed. Each small detail might eventually contribute to understanding the larger picture. One particularly interesting discovery involved protective equipment. According to reports, 2 sets of waterproof outer clothing were missing. One set remained hanging inside the lighthouse. This simple fact immediately raised important questions. Normally, keepers wore heavy waterproof coats before going outdoors during rough weather. If only 2 sets were missing, did that mean one man had left without proper protection? Why would an experienced keeper do such a thing? Had conditions appeared calm when they first stepped outside, or had someone rushed out unexpectedly? Historians continue discussing this detail today because surviving reports differ slightly in their descriptions. Some accounts written years later added certainty where the earliest documents remained more cautious. Even so, the clothing became one of the most frequently discussed pieces of evidence. Muirhead also studied the official lighthouse log. Daily records formed an essential part of every station's routine. Weather conditions, maintenance work, unusual events, everything important was documented. Unfortunately, later retellings of the mystery often introduced dramatic entries that almost certainly never existed. Stories spread claiming that experienced keepers had written about impossible storms, unusual fears, or emotional distress. Modern historians have carefully examined these claims. Most conclude that such dramatic entries originated many years after the actual event. They do not appear in the original official investigation. Instead, the authentic records remain remarkably ordinary. That simplicity itself became part of the mystery. There was no written warning, no request for assistance, no indication that the keepers expected danger beyond the normal challenges of winter.
As the investigation continued, Muirhead considered the geography of the island itself. The cliffs surrounding the lighthouse rose steeply above the sea. In many places, they offered almost no possibility of survival if someone slipped into the water below. Powerful waves smashed repeatedly against solid rock. Even strong swimmers would have faced almost impossible conditions. Recovery of bodies in such an environment would have been extremely difficult. Ocean currents could carry debris far from the islands. Winter temperatures further reduced any chance of survival. Gradually, one possible explanation began to form. Not a perfect explanation, but one grounded firmly in the physical evidence. Perhaps the keepers had gone outside to secure equipment during severe weather. Perhaps one man had been caught unexpectedly by an enormous wave. The other two, seeing their colleague in danger, rushed forward to help. Then all three were swept into the sea. It was a tragic possibility, one supported by the damaged equipment near the western landing, one consistent with the power of Atlantic storms. Yet even this theory left unanswered questions. Why would all three experienced keepers leave the lighthouse at the same time? Regulations normally required at least one man to remain inside, operating the light. Experienced keepers understood that rule well. Would they really have abandoned the station together? Or had circumstances become so urgent that normal procedures no longer seemed possible? The investigation continued. The questions multiplied, but clear answers remained frustratingly beyond reach.
As Robert Muirhead completed his inspection of the Flannan Isles lighthouse, one conclusion seemed increasingly likely. The sea itself had somehow played a central role. No evidence pointed toward violence. No signs suggested robbery. Nothing indicated that the three keepers had chosen to disappear voluntarily. Instead, nearly every physical clue directed attention towards the powerful Atlantic surrounding the island. Yet understanding exactly how such an accident could have occurred proved far more difficult. The western landing was unlike the eastern side of the island. It faced directly toward the open ocean. There was nothing to weaken the force of incoming waves. For thousands of miles, winter storms could gather strength before finally striking the cliffs of the Flannan Isles. On calm days, the landing platform allowed supplies to be unloaded safely. In severe weather, however, it became one of the most dangerous places imaginable. The investigators carefully examined the damaged equipment found there. A storage box had been broken apart. Iron railings had been bent. Ropes normally secured in place had been torn loose. Heavy crates had shifted from their usual positions. These were not small changes. They suggested tremendous force. Modern oceanographers studying the case have noted that unusually large waves, sometimes called rogue waves, can occasionally develop under the right conditions. These waves are rare, but they are entirely natural. Unlike ordinary waves, they can rise unexpectedly far above surrounding seas. When they strike rocky coastlines, the impact can be astonishing. In 1900, however, the lighthouse keepers had no modern scientific explanation for such events. They simply knew the Atlantic demanded respect. Every experienced sailor understood that storms could behave unpredictably. Perhaps the keepers noticed that some equipment near the western landing had broken loose. If strong winds threatened to carry valuable supplies into the sea, someone might have decided to secure them before conditions became even worse. That possibility seemed reasonable. Lighthouse property represented government equipment. Protecting it formed part of the keepers' responsibilities. Still, another question remained.
why were all 3 men missing? Lighthouse regulations were very clear. One keeper normally remained inside the station whenever the others worked outdoors. The light could never be left completely unattended. This rule existed for good reason. Unexpected problems could develop at any moment. Someone needed to remain available. If all 3 men had indeed gone outside together, something unusual must have influenced that decision. Some historians have suggested that one keeper may have first gone outside alone. Perhaps he noticed damage requiring immediate attention. Perhaps another keeper followed to assist. Finally, the third may have left the lighthouse after realizing additional help was needed. Such a sequence would explain why the station eventually became empty. Yet no document confirms this idea. It remains only one possibility among several. Others have proposed that the weather initially appeared much calmer. The keepers may have believed they had plenty of time to complete a quick repair before conditions worsened. Winter weather often changes rapidly. A peaceful afternoon can become dangerous within minutes. If enormous waves arrived unexpectedly, escape might have been impossible. Again, the theory fits the evidence, but certainty remains beyond reach. As the investigation continued, Muirhead interviewed people familiar with the keepers. Their backgrounds attracted careful attention. James Ducat was known as a reliable and disciplined employee. His record contained no indication of reckless behavior. Thomas Marshall possessed extensive maritime experience. He understood storms perhaps better than anyone. Donald MacArthur had also earned a reputation as a capable worker. Although sometimes described as energetic and outspoken, no evidence suggested irresponsibility. Nothing in the men's professional histories hinted that they would knowingly ignore safety procedures. Their disappearance therefore became even more puzzling. Investigators also considered whether someone from outside the island might somehow have become involved. Could another vessel have landed secretly? Could strangers have arrived? The geography made such ideas unlikely. Landing on the Flannan Isles in winter required favorable weather and considerable skill. Any visiting ship would probably have been noticed by passing vessels or coastal observers. No such reports existed. Likewise, there was no evidence of theft. Money remained inside the lighthouse. Personal belongings had not been disturbed. Nothing appeared missing except the keepers themselves. Gradually, official opinion continued moving towards a tragic maritime accident. Not because every question had been answered, but because no stronger explanation emerged. The sea remained the most convincing suspect. In the weeks following the investigation, newspapers finally began reporting the disappearance of the keepers. Readers across Britain found the story fascinating. 3 men had vanished from a remote lighthouse. No witnesses, no bodies, no clear explanation. The mystery seemed almost impossible to imagine. As often happens, newspapers occasionally emphasized the more dramatic aspects of the story. Some articles speculated freely. Others repeated rumors that could not be verified. Public curiosity grew quickly. People wanted answers. Unfortunately, history rarely provides perfect answers, especially in isolated places where evidence is limited. Over the following decades, the Flannan Isles mystery gradually transformed from a workplace investigation into one of Britain's most famous unsolved historical cases. Writers added details. Storytellers introduced conversations that had never been recorded. Some invented strange logbook entries. Others imagined strange lights in the sky or unexplained voices carried by the wind. These additions made the story more dramatic. They also moved it farther away from the historical evidence. Modern historians have worked carefully to separate fact from fiction. The original investigation remains surprisingly practical. No ghosts, no monsters, no supernatural events. Only 3 experienced lighthouse keepers, a dangerous coastline, evidence of powerful storm damage, and an accident that may have unfolded so quickly that no one had any opportunity to return. Even today, standing on the western cliffs of the Flannan Isles, visitors can appreciate the immense power of the Atlantic. The ocean stretches endlessly towards the horizon. Wind moves constantly across the grass. Below, waves continue striking the rocks with the same relentless force they carried more than 100 years ago. Nature has changed very little. It still reminds every visitor of one simple truth. The sea does not need mystery to be powerful. Its ordinary strength is already extraordinary. And somewhere within that strength may lie the quiet answer to one of history's most enduring disappearances.
As the years passed, the disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers slowly became something more than an official investigation. It became a story passed from one generation to the next. Sailors told it while crossing the North Atlantic. Families repeated it beside warm fireplaces during long winter evenings. Writers included it in collections of unexplained mysteries. With each retelling, the line between historical fact and popular legend became a little less clear. This often happens when history leaves important questions unanswered. People naturally try to complete the missing pieces. Sometimes those additions are thoughtful. Sometimes they become imaginative. And sometimes they move far beyond the available evidence. The Flannan Isles mystery experienced exactly this transformation. One of the most famous examples involves the Lighthouse logbook. According to many books, the keepers supposedly recorded terrifying storms unlike anything they had ever experienced. Some versions claimed that one keeper wrote another man had been crying. Others suggested the men prayed together because they believed death was approaching. These passages appear dramatic. They are memorable. They create a powerful emotional atmosphere. Yet they remain poetry rather than history. Gibson never claimed to describe the actual events. Instead, he explored the emotions surrounding an unanswered mystery. Readers sometimes confused artistic interpretation with historical evidence. Over time, those boundaries blurred. Novelists introduced strangers arriving secretly on the island. Some imagined foreign spies. Others suggested pirates. A few proposed that the men discovered hidden treasure. There were stories of sea monsters, ancient curses, strange lights moving across the cliffs, even mysterious creatures emerging from the Atlantic fog. These ideas certainly entertained audiences, but none found support within the official investigation. The Flannan Isles themselves encouraged such storytelling. Their isolation created a perfect setting for mystery. When people imagine lonely island surrounded by endless ocean, they often expect unusual events. Yet the real islands remain wonderfully ordinary. Grass grows across the rocky slopes. Seabirds build their nests along the cliffs. Wind blows steadily throughout the seasons. Nature follows its own quiet rhythms. There is nothing supernatural about the landscape, only remarkable beauty and extraordinary isolation. Modern visitors often describe the islands as peaceful rather than frightening. Standing beside the lighthouse, they hear little beyond waves, birds, and wind. The silence feels calming, almost timeless. It becomes easy to understand why lighthouse keepers developed deep respect for the place.
Life there required patience. The outside world seemed very far away. Even today, reaching the islands depends entirely upon weather. Strong winds can delay boats for days. Large waves still make landing difficult. The same conditions faced by the keepers more than a century ago continue to shape every visit. That consistency reminds historians of something important. The environment itself has changed very little. If the Atlantic was capable of producing enormous waves in 1900, it remains capable of doing so today. Modern measurements have recorded waves striking coastal cliffs with astonishing force. Engineers studying exposed shorelines continue documenting how powerful winter storms can become. Nature alone is often more dramatic than fiction. Perhaps that's why the simplest explanation continues attracting the greatest support. Not because it answers every question, but because it respects both the evidence and the remarkable power of the sea. Still, one mystery remains especially difficult to explain. If the keepers recognized danger, why did none survive? Experienced lighthouse men understood these islands better than almost anyone. They knew where storms struck hardest. They knew which paths became slippery. They understood the unpredictable nature of Atlantic weather. Yet even knowledge has limits. Sometimes nature changes faster than experience can predict. Sometimes a single unexpected moment alters everything. The Atlantic has always demanded humility from those who travel upon it. It rewards preparation, but it never guarantees safety. As evening settled once again across the lonely Flannan Isles in the years that followed, the lighthouse continued sending its faithful beam across the dark sea. New keepers arrived. New routines began. Ships passed safely through the night. Life quietly moved forward. Yet every man who climbed the tower knew the story of those who had served there before. 3 experienced keepers, 1 winter, 1 unanswered disappearance, and a mystery that, despite all the legends surrounding it, may ultimately belong not to myth, but to the immense and unpredictable power of the sea.
Long after the newspapers stopped printing new headlines, the Flannan Isles continued to attract visitors. Not crowds of tourists. The islands were far too remote for that. Instead, they drew lighthouse officials, sailors, historians, and occasionally a few curious travelers willing to cross the rough Atlantic waters. Almost everyone arrived with the same question: what really happened here? Standing on the island, that question feels different than it does when reading about the mystery at home. The cliffs are higher than most people expect. The ocean seems larger, and the distance to the mainland suddenly becomes very real. From the western side of the island, the Atlantic stretches toward the horizon with almost nothing to interrupt it. When the wind rises, its sound fills every corner of the landscape. Even a calm day carries a sense of exposure. There is nowhere to hide from the weather. Early visitors often searched for signs that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. They examined the landing places, studied the cliffs, measured distances. Many were surprised by how difficult movement could become when waves and wind increased. Paths that appear simple in photographs feel much narrower when standing beside a steep drop into the sea. One particularly important feature was the western landing platform. This was the area where investigators had found storm damage in 1900. The platform sat close to the open Atlantic. During heavy weather, enormous waves could strike the rocks below and send spray high into the air. Later engineers studying the site discovered something remarkable. Marks left by the sea showed that water had occasionally reached heights far above what many people once believed possible. Heavy objects had been moved, iron fittings had been bent. The Atlantic had clearly demonstrated extraordinary power there. These observations strengthened the accident theory. Perhaps the keepers had gone outside to secure equipment after noticing dangerous conditions. Perhaps a wave larger than expected struck the platform. Perhaps events unfolded so quickly that no one had time to escape. The more researchers studied the geography, the more realistic this possibility appeared. Still, the mystery refused to disappear completely. Human beings naturally focus on the unanswered parts of a story. If one keeper was swept away first, why did the others follow? Why did all three experienced men end up outside at the same time? Could a sudden emergency have drawn them there together? Or did the sequence happen in stages, one man after another? No surviving evidence can answer these questions with certainty. That uncertainty is the reason the story remains alive today. During the 20th century, lighthouse technology began changing. Automatic systems gradually reduced the need for keepers to live in extremely isolated stations. Eventually, the Flannan Isles lighthouse itself became automated. The great lantern continued shining, but no permanent crew remained on the island. The buildings that once echoed with conversation grew quiet. Bedrooms stood empty. The kitchen no longer smelled of tea and coal smoke. Only occasional maintenance workers visited for short periods. In a strange way, the island became even more isolated than it had been in 1900. This change created a powerful atmosphere for later visitors. Imagine walking through the old keepers' quarters, knowing that men once lived there through long Atlantic winters. Imagine hearing only wind moving around the stone walls. Imagine looking out the same windows where the keepers watched approaching storms more than a century ago. The silence feels almost tangible. Yet it is not a frightening silence. It is the silence of a place that has simply returned to nature. Seabirds now dominate the islands. Gannets, puffins, and other ocean birds nest along the cliffs. Their calls often become the loudest sounds in the landscape. Grass bends continuously beneath the wind. The lighthouse tower still rises above everything else, calm and steady against the changing sky. Many historians believe that visiting the island helps explain why supernatural theories became so popular. The setting is undeniably dramatic. A remote lighthouse, towering cliffs, winter storms, 3 missing men. It feels like the beginning of a mystery novel. But the physical evidence points towards something more ordinary, though no less tragic. Nature alone may have been enough. Modern oceanographers have studied how waves behave around isolated islands. Under certain conditions, reflected waves can combine with incoming swells to create unexpectedly large surges. These waves may appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly. A person standing near the edge at the wrong moment could be caught completely off guard. This does not prove what happened at Flannan, but it demonstrates that the Atlantic is capable of producing events that seem almost unbelievable to anyone watching from a safe distance. The keepers themselves would have understood this more than most people. They had spent years observing the sea. They knew that calm water could become dangerous within minutes. They respected the ocean precisely because it was unpredictable. That respect may be one reason many investigators hesitate to blame carelessness. Experienced lighthouse men rarely ignored obvious danger. If they went outside during severe weather, they likely believed they had a good reason. Perhaps equipment had broken loose. Perhaps a rope needed securing.
Perhaps one man was already in difficulty. Small emergencies can escalate quickly on isolated coastlines. A decision that seems reasonable one moment can become deadly the next. As evening falls over the Flannan Isles today, the lighthouse still sends its beam across the Atlantic. Ships continue passing safely through the darkness. Most sailors know little about the events of December 1900. They see only a reliable light guiding them through dangerous waters. In that sense, the lighthouse continues fulfilling the same purpose it was built for more than a century ago. The mystery remains, the ocean remains, and the lonely islands continue standing where they always have, surrounded by wind, waves, and the quiet questions that history has never been able to answer completely.
As the 20th century continued, the mystery of the Flannan Isles slowly spread far beyond the coast of Scotland. What had begun as an official investigation eventually found its way into books, magazines, radio programs, documentaries, and later, the Internet. Each generation discovered the story in its own way, and each generation asked the same quiet question. If the evidence seems to point toward an accident, why does the mystery still feel unsolved? The answer lies in something surprisingly simple. There were no witnesses. No one saw the final moments of the three keepers. Every conclusion must therefore be built from evidence that survived after they were gone. Historians are comfortable with this uncertainty. In fact, much of historical research works exactly this way. Ancient cities, lost expeditions, forgotten settlements. Researchers often reconstruct events using only scattered clues. The Flannan Isles are no different. Every official report, every weather record, every photograph, and every surviving document becomes another piece of a puzzle that may never be completely finished. Over the decades, many experts returned to the original evidence rather than the popular legends. They carefully compared newspaper articles with official reports. They studied maps of the island. They examined shipping records from December 1900. Some even recreated the weather conditions using modern scientific methods. Their goal was not to create a more exciting story. It was to understand the most likely one. One important source of information came from weather observations recorded across western Scotland. Although no detailed weather station existed on the Flannan Isles at the time, nearby records showed that severe storms moved through the region during the days surrounding the disappearance. Powerful winds were reported. Large Atlantic swells developed. Coastal communities experienced difficult conditions. These reports supported the idea that the keepers faced dangerous weather. However, they also revealed something interesting. Not every area experienced the storm at exactly the same time. Weather in the North Atlantic often changes rapidly over relatively short distances. One island may remain calm while another is struck by violent waves. This may explain why some passing ships reported ordinary conditions while the lighthouse station itself experienced far greater danger. Geography matters. The western side of the Flannan Isles directly faces thousands of miles of open ocean. There are no large land masses to weaken incoming swells. Wave after wave travels uninterrupted before striking the cliffs. Under the right conditions, enormous walls of water can suddenly appear. Modern photographs taken during winter storms help visitors appreciate this reality.
Spray rises high above the rocks. Foam fills the air. The sea seems almost alive as it crashes against the coastline. Standing safely above the cliffs, observers quickly understand why lighthouse keepers treated the Atlantic with such respect. Researchers also considered human behavior. What would experienced keepers likely do if equipment became loose during a storm? Would they risk going outside? Most experts believe the answer depends entirely on the circumstances. If heavy ropes, supply crates, or lifting equipment threatened to be destroyed, the men might have believed immediate action was necessary. Waiting until morning could mean losing valuable equipment essential for operating the station. Government property was expected to be protected whenever possible. Responsibility often carries risk. Unfortunately, responsibility sometimes carries risk. The investigators never suggested that the keepers acted carelessly. Instead, they likely acted exactly as dedicated professionals often do. They responded to a problem. They attempted to solve it. And nature proved stronger than anyone expected. This possibility carries a quiet sadness, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so ordinary. History contains many tragedies born from people simply doing their jobs. Lighthouse keepers accepted danger as part of everyday life. Sailors accepted storms. Miners accepted unstable tunnels. Railroad workers accepted difficult conditions. Most returned home safely. A few never did. The Flannan Isles may belong to that long history of ordinary courage. In later years, divers occasionally explored waters surrounding the islands. Strong currents, great depths, and difficult underwater conditions limited what could realistically be found. No evidence emerged that significantly changed the investigation. The Atlantic had kept its silence. Ocean currents are powerful. Objects entering the sea may travel astonishing distances. Some are never recovered. This unfortunate reality has affected countless maritime accidents throughout history. The absence of physical remains, while emotionally difficult, is not unusual in such environments. The lighthouse itself continued serving mariners for many decades. Its purpose never changed. Night after night, its light crossed the darkness just as it had before the disappearance. Thousands of ships safely navigated past the dangerous coastline because of that steady beacon. Few passengers aboard those vessels realized they were passing one of Britain's most famous historical mysteries. Today, the lighthouse stands not only as a navigational aid, but also as a quiet memorial. It reminds visitors of three men whose work protected countless strangers: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. They rarely sought recognition during their lifetimes. Like many lighthouse keepers, they performed their duties quietly, without expecting fame. History remembered them only because of the questions left behind. Perhaps there is something meaningful in that. Not every mystery exists because of hidden secrets. Sometimes a mystery survives simply because time removed the final pieces of evidence before anyone could see them. Nature is patient. The sea keeps very few records. Wind leaves no written account. Waves tell no stories. They simply continue their endless rhythm, just as they did in the winter of 1900. And somewhere in that rhythm, the final moments of the three keepers disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that continues to invite careful thought rather than certain answers.
More than 100 years have passed since the 3 lighthouse keepers disappeared from the Flannan Isles. During that time, the world has changed almost beyond recognition. Satellites now circle the Earth. Ships navigate with computers and global positioning systems. Weather forecasts predict approaching storms days before they arrive. Lighthouses that once required constant human attention now operate automatically, guided by modern technology. Yet despite all these advances, the mystery of the Flannan Isles remains remarkably unchanged. Not because people stopped searching for answers, but because history sometimes reaches a point where every surviving piece of evidence has already been examined. Modern historians continue returning to the original investigation. Again and again, they compare the official reports with later accounts. They separate documented facts from stories added decades afterward. This careful work has transformed the mystery in an interesting way. Rather than becoming more mysterious, it has become more human. The earliest newspaper articles often focused on dramatic possibilities. Readers were fascinated by disappearances. Publishers understood that mystery attracted attention. As a result, sensational explanations spread quickly. Over time, many people came to believe those stories represented established fact. The reality proved quieter. The official investigation never described supernatural events. No unexplained lights appeared in the reports. No mysterious strangers were seen approaching the island. No evidence supported attacks by pirates or foreign agents. Instead, investigators described damaged equipment, severe weather, and an isolated lighthouse suddenly left without its keepers. Sometimes the simplest explanation is also the hardest to accept. People naturally hope for complete answers. We want every question resolved, every mystery explained. History rarely offers such certainty. The Flannan Isles remind us that evidence has limits. If no witness survives and no final record exists, some details may remain permanently beyond our reach. That uncertainty does not weaken history. It simply reflects reality. Archaeologists often experience something similar. A broken pottery fragment can reveal how people cooked meals centuries ago. An old coin may identify the year a settlement existed. But many ordinary moments disappear forever. Conversations vanish. Thoughts remain unrecorded. Small decisions leave no physical trace. The disappearance of the lighthouse keepers belongs to that category of history. We know where they lived. We know their responsibilities. We know the condition of the lighthouse after they disappeared. We know storms affected the area. What we do not know is the exact sequence of events during those final hours. Researchers have also studied the psychology of people working in extreme isolation. Long periods spent in remote locations require patience and emotional resilience. Lighthouse keepers often developed disciplined routines to maintain both efficiency and well-being. Regular work created structure. Shared meals strengthened companionship. Reading, letter writing, and simple conversation helped pass the long evenings. The Flannan keepers almost certainly followed similar patterns. Nothing in their employment records suggested instability. Quite the opposite. They were trusted with one of Scotland's most important navigational stations. Trust was earned through years of dependable service.
That trust makes theories involving deliberate disappearance seem far less convincing. Why would experienced professionals suddenly abandon everything? Why leave behind personal belongings? Why disappear without preparing for travel? Such ideas require assumptions unsupported by the evidence. The accident theory, while incomplete, demands fewer assumptions. It fits both the physical environment and the known facts. Many maritime historians therefore continue considering it the strongest explanation, not because it solves every detail, but because it remains consistent with what investigators actually found. Standing near the western landing today, visitors can appreciate just how exposed the location truly is. The Atlantic never seems still for long. Even on peaceful afternoons, waves continue striking the cliffs with steady determination. Wind whistles across the open grasslands. Salt fills the air. It becomes easy to imagine how quickly conditions could change. The keepers themselves likely accepted this environment as part of everyday life. Familiarity, however, does not eliminate danger. Even experienced mountaineers occasionally encounter unexpected avalanches. Veteran sailors still face unpredictable seas. Skilled pilots respect changing weather. Experience reduces risk. It never removes it entirely. Perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons hidden within the Flannan mystery. Nature deserves constant respect, not because it is mysterious, but because it is powerful. The Atlantic asks for patience, preparation, humility. It has asked the same things from generations of fishermen, sailors, lighthouse keepers, and coastal communities. Most listened carefully. Some still encountered circumstances beyond anyone's control. As evening settles once more across the lonely islands, the lighthouse continues its silent work. Its beam sweeps across the dark water with the same steady rhythm that sailors trusted more than a century ago. The cliffs remain unchanged. The seabirds continue nesting among the rocks. Winter storms still arrive from the west. Time has transformed the world beyond the islands, yet the islands themselves seem almost untouched. Perhaps that timeless landscape explains why the story continues to capture people's imagination. The mystery is not only about 3 missing men, it is also about a place where nature still follows the same ancient rhythms, a place where silence speaks more softly than certainty, a place where history gently reminds us that not every unanswered question requires an extraordinary explanation. Sometimes the greatest mysteries begin with ordinary people simply carrying out their daily work beneath an endless northern sky.
As historians continued studying the disappearance throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, an interesting pattern began to emerge. The more carefully researchers examined the original evidence, the more they appreciated the remarkable professionalism of the 3 lighthouse keepers. Rather than viewing them as characters in a mysterious legend, historians increasingly saw them as skilled workers performing one of the most demanding occupations of their time. To understand their final days, it helps to understand the world in which they lived. At the beginning of the 20th century, lighthouses were among the most important pieces of public infrastructure along dangerous coastlines. Before radar, before satellite navigation, before electronic charts, a lighthouse often represented the single most reliable guide through darkness, fog, and storm. Captains trusted those lights completely. Many lives depended upon them. Every evening,
Somewhere along Britain's rugged shores, hundreds of lighthouse keepers quietly began their work. Most people never knew their names. Their success was measured by something wonderfully simple. If nothing happened, they had done their jobs well. Ships arrived safely. Families welcomed loved ones home. Cargo reached distant ports. The light continued shining. It was quiet work, but deeply important. The keepers of the Flannan Isles belonged to that tradition. James Ducat had earned respect through years of dependable service. His colleagues described him as careful and responsible. Thomas Marshall possessed extensive experience at sea before entering lighthouse work. He understood weather with the confidence that only years of observation can provide. Donald MacArthur, serving as a relief keeper, accepted temporary duty on one of Scotland's most isolated stations without hesitation. Together, the three men represented exactly the type of employees the Northern Lighthouse Board wanted, protecting such an important location. Their disappearance therefore shocked not only the public, but also their fellow keepers. Many lighthouse workers struggled to imagine how easily three experienced colleagues could vanish so completely. Some undoubtedly recognized how easily circumstances could change on an exposed coastline. Others quietly wondered whether they themselves might have made similar decisions under difficult conditions. That thought carried particular weight because lighthouse keepers understood something many people living inland rarely considered. Nature does not always announce danger gradually. Sometimes the sea changes within moments. A wave larger than those before it, a sudden shift in the wind, a loose rope snapping unexpectedly. Small events can combine with surprising speed. Modern safety procedures often develop after tragedies teach difficult lessons. The Flannan mystery encouraged lighthouse authorities to review working practices carefully. Although no investigation could reverse what had happened, every effort was made to reduce future risks at remote stations. Over time, improvements continued. Communication systems became more reliable. Landing equipment grew stronger. Weather forecasting improved steadily. Eventually, radio allowed isolated stations to remain in regular contact with the mainland. Later still, automation reduced the need for permanent crews at many remote lighthouses. Technology quietly solved problems that earlier generations simply accepted as part of everyday life. Yet, despite these advances, experienced mariners continue respecting the ocean exactly as their predecessors did. Modern ships may carry advanced navigational equipment, but storms still command attention. Coastal rescue organizations still train constantly. Weather warnings remain essential. The Atlantic has not become less powerful simply because human technology has improved. Standing beside the old Flannan Lighthouse today, visitors often notice something unexpected. The place feels peaceful. The mystery has never given the islands a sense of fear. Instead, there is a remarkable calm. Grass moves gently in the wind. Seabirds drift effortlessly above the cliffs. The lighthouse rises quietly against the changing sky. Nothing about the landscape suggests violence. Nothing hints at extraordinary events. Only history encourages the imagination. Perhaps that is why so many visitors leave with a different impression than they expected. Rather than discovering a haunted place, they discover a beautiful one, a place shaped by wind, sea, and time, a place where ordinary people once carried out extraordinary responsibilities. The mystery remains, but the islands themselves ask for no dramatic explanation. They simply exist, just as they always have. Many historians believe this perspective is important. Respecting history means accepting uncertainty when evidence is incomplete. It is tempting to invent missing details. Doing so creates satisfying stories. But genuine history often feels quieter, more patient, more honest. The disappearance of the Flannan keepers reminds us that unanswered questions do not automatically require extraordinary answers. Sometimes the truth is simply beyond recovery, not because anyone concealed it, but because nature moved faster than memory. The Atlantic left no written record. The wind carried away every spoken word. The waves preserved no final witness. Only the lighthouse remained, still standing, still shining, still performing the duty for which it had been built. Every night its beam crossed the same dark waters where countless ships continued their journeys. Generations of sailors benefited from that light without ever meeting the men whose work had helped establish its reputation. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. Their names remain part of maritime history, not because they sought fame, but because they quietly served others until history itself lost sight of them. Perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Flannan Isles, not the mystery alone, but the quiet dedication of 3 ordinary men whose final story was never completely written, leaving future generations to remember both their service and the questions that still drift gently across the lonely Atlantic.
More than a century has passed since the winter of 1900, yet the Flannan Isles continue to remind us how closely history and nature are connected. Many historical mysteries survive not because someone deliberately hid the truth, but because time slowly erased the final pieces of evidence. The disappearance of the 3 lighthouse keepers belongs to that quiet category of history. There is no secret document waiting to be discovered, no forgotten witness expected to appear, no hidden room inside the lighthouse containing the final answer. What remains are careful records, thoughtful investigation, and a landscape that has changed very little since those December days. Today, historians often encourage people to look beyond the mystery itself and consider the larger story. The lighthouse was built to save lives. For generations, dangerous coastlines had claimed countless ships. The construction of reliable navigation systems represented one of the great engineering achievements of the 19th century. Every new lighthouse reduced the risks faced by sailors. Every beam of light increased the chances that families would see loved ones return safely. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse was part of that larger effort. Its story is therefore not only about disappearance, it is also about service. The men stationed there accepted weeks of isolation because they understood the importance of their work. Their daily routines may seem repetitive to modern readers: cleaning the lantern, checking the fuel, recording the weather, inspecting machinery, preparing meals, repeating the same tasks day after day. Yet every routine had a purpose. Small acts of discipline created extraordinary reliability. Ships crossing the Atlantic depended upon people they would never meet. That quiet connection between strangers is one of the most remarkable aspects of lighthouse history. Many visitors who explore maritime museums notice how modest lighthouse keepers' lives actually were. Their living quarters were comfortable but simple. Furniture was practical. Clothing was durable rather than fashionable. Entertainment remained limited. Books, letters, conversation, occasional music. Most evenings ended early because the next day's responsibilities always arrived on time. Modern life often celebrates constant activity. The lighthouse keepers lived differently. Their world moved according to sunrise and sunset. Weather determined schedules. The sea decided when supplies arrived. Patience became an everyday habit. Perhaps that slower rhythm explains why the story feels especially peaceful when viewed from a historical perspective. The mystery itself is certainly compelling, but the lives surrounding the mystery deserve equal attention. These were ordinary working men. They laughed, they wrote letters home, they prepared meals together, they discussed weather forecasts and passing ships. Like countless people throughout history, they simply hoped to complete another period of work before returning safely to their families. Unfortunately, history sometimes remembers people because ordinary plans are unexpectedly interrupted. As researchers continued studying the disappearance, another valuable lesson gradually emerged. Historical investigation requires humility. Not every unanswered question has a complete answer waiting somewhere. Sometimes the available evidence allows only probabilities rather than certainty. Responsible historians accept this limitation. Instead of claiming to know more than the evidence supports, they carefully explain what is known and what remains uncertain. The Flannan investigation reflects that approach beautifully. The damaged equipment near the western landing is real. The isolated location is real. The severe Atlantic weather is real. The disappearance is real. Beyond those facts, careful reasoning becomes necessary. Most modern experts continue supporting the accidental wave theory because it fits the evidence better than alternative explanations. Yet they also acknowledge that absolute certainty is impossible. This balance between confidence and caution represents good historical scholarship. It respects both evidence and uncertainty. Visitors reaching the islands today often spend time simply listening. There is surprisingly little noise, no traffic, no distant machinery, only wind moving through grass, birds calling overhead, waves meeting ancient cliffs. The silence feels almost timeless. Standing there, it becomes easier to imagine life as the keepers experienced it. Long hours, changing weather, endless horizons, the steady responsibility of keeping the light burning every night. Perhaps the greatest tribute to the keepers is that the lighthouse continued fulfilling its purpose after they were gone. Other keepers arrived. The lantern shone again. Generations of sailors crossed those dangerous waters safely. Eventually, modern technology transformed lighthouse operations, but the mission remained unchanged. Protect lives, guide ships, stand faithfully against darkness. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse still represents that mission today. Its stone walls have endured countless storms. Its tower has watched more than a century of changing seas. The mystery remains part of its history, but it does not define the entire place. Instead, the lighthouse stands as a quiet monument to perseverance, responsibility, and the enduring relationship between people and the sea. As evening once again settles across the North Atlantic, the light continues sweeping across the water. Each slow rotation connects the present with the past. It is the same coastline, the same cliffs,
the same restless ocean, only the generations have changed. And somewhere within that endless rhythm, the memory of 3 dedicated lighthouse keepers continues to drift gently across the Atlantic, carried not by certainty, but by quiet respect.
As our journey through the history of the Flannan Isles begins to draw toward its conclusion, it is worth pausing to consider why this particular story has endured for more than a century. Thousands of ships have been lost at sea. Countless storms have shaped the coastlines of Scotland. Many lighthouse keepers have spent quiet years serving on isolated stations. Yet only a handful of these stories continue to capture the imagination of people around the world. The Flannan Isles mystery remains memorable because it combines 2 powerful elements. The first is the beauty of an isolated landscape. The second is the absence of certainty. Human beings naturally search for complete endings. When history leaves a chapter unfinished, curiosity often continues for generations. Every few years, a new article appears. A documentary revisits the evidence. A historian publishes another careful examination of the official reports. Readers return, hoping that perhaps one overlooked detail will finally explain everything. So far, none has. Instead, each new study tends to strengthen the same quiet conclusion. The Atlantic was and remains an extraordinarily powerful place. Its storms require respect. Its waves can reshape coastlines. Its currents can carry away almost every physical trace of an accident. The mystery survives not because the evidence points toward impossible events, but because the evidence ends before the final moments can be seen. There is something deeply human about accepting that reality. Modern science has helped us understand the ocean far better than people could in 1900. Satellites monitor weather systems. Ocean buoys record wave heights. Researchers study currents using sophisticated instruments. Computer models simulate storms across entire oceans. Even with all this knowledge, the sea still surprises experienced sailors. Unexpected waves continue to occur. Rapid weather changes still challenge navigation. Nature remains wonderfully complex. That perspective encourages humility. The lighthouse keepers understood this long before modern technology existed. They did not attempt to conquer the sea. They learned to work alongside it. Every evening they prepared the great lantern. Every night they watched over passing ships. Every morning they inspected equipment before beginning another quiet day. Their profession required consistency rather than excitement. Most days passed peacefully. Only occasionally did nature remind everyone who truly controlled the coastline. Today, visitors reaching the Flannan Isles often describe a feeling of timelessness. The grass still bends beneath the same Atlantic wind. The cliffs still rise above restless water. Seabirds still nest in the rocky ledges. Clouds drift overhead much as they did generations ago. Even the lighthouse itself appears remarkably unchanged. Standing beside the old stone tower, it becomes easy to imagine the keepers walking the familiar paths between the buildings, lighting the lamp, checking the weather, watching distant ships disappear beyond the horizon. History feels unusually close in such places, not because ghosts remain, but because the landscape preserves memory so well. Unlike cities that constantly rebuild themselves, remote islands often change very slowly. Nature quietly protects the past. Perhaps that is why the Flannan Isles continue attracting thoughtful visitors rather than thrill seekers.
Most people arrive not expecting supernatural discoveries, but hoping to better understand the lives of the men who once called the island home. They leave with a deeper appreciation for both the beauty and the difficulty of that life. Historians often remind us that every generation views the past through its own experiences. Early newspaper readers focused on mystery. Later writers emphasized adventure. Modern researchers tend to value evidence above speculation. Each approach reflects the time in which it developed. Today, careful historical scholarship encourages patience. When evidence is incomplete, honesty requires acknowledging uncertainty rather than filling empty spaces with dramatic invention. The Flannan Isles have become an excellent example of this principle. The story teaches us not only about lighthouse keepers, but also about the way history itself is studied. Questions matter. Evidence matters. And sometimes accepting uncertainty is the most truthful conclusion available. As evening approaches once more, imagine the lighthouse standing alone against the darkening Atlantic sky. The first stars slowly appear above the horizon. Far below, waves continue their endless rhythm against the cliffs. A fresh breeze carries the scent of salt across the island. Somewhere in the distance, a ship notices the familiar beam turning steadily through the night. The passengers aboard may never know the history behind that quiet light. They simply trust it, just as generations of sailors have trusted it before them. Perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse. Its greatest achievement has never been the mystery. Its greatest achievement has always been the countless lives it helped guide safely through dangerous waters. The 3 keepers who disappeared in the winter of 1900 became part of that larger story. Their names remain remembered because history could not record their final moments, but their work continues to be honored every time the lighthouse is remembered, not as a place of fear, but as a symbol of quiet dedication, responsibility, and service beneath the vast northern sky. The final chapter of their story still cannot be written with complete certainty, yet perhaps certainty is not always necessary. Sometimes remembrance is enough. Sometimes quiet respect is the most meaningful ending history can offer. And as the Atlantic continues its endless conversation with the cliffs, the Flannan Isles remain exactly where they have always been, silent, beautiful, and patiently keeping one of history's oldest unanswered questions.
Night has fallen again over the Flannan Isles. The last colors of sunset have faded beyond the western horizon. The Atlantic has become a deep shade of blue, almost black, beneath the quiet sky. Far above, countless stars slowly appear, reflecting softly upon the restless sea. The lighthouse continues its patient work. Its great beam turns with steady rhythm, reaching across the darkness exactly as it has for generations. Ships passing far beyond the cliffs see only a familiar light. For those sailors, it is simply another guide leading them safely home. Few know the long history behind its quiet presence. Fewer still know the names of the 3 men whose disappearance forever became part of its story. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. More than a century has passed since they walked these lonely paths. The wind that once touched their faces still moves across the island today. The waves that echoed beneath the cliffs continue their endless journey. The seabirds return each spring, just as they always have. Nature remembers time differently than people do. To the ocean, 100 years is only a brief moment. The cliffs remain unchanged. The lighthouse still stands. The Atlantic continues breathing in its slow, timeless rhythm. Perhaps that is why this story has endured for so long. Not because it promises extraordinary answers, but because it reminds us how small human lives can appear beside the vastness of nature, and yet how meaningful those lives remain. The three lighthouse keepers were not kings. They were not famous explorers. They were not military heroes whose names filled history books. They were ordinary working men. They accepted difficult assignments. They lived far from their families for weeks at a time. They maintained a light that protected strangers they would never meet. Night after night, they quietly performed their duties without expecting recognition. Thousands of sailors reached safety because someone kept that lantern burning. That quiet service deserves remembrance. History often celebrates dramatic victories and remarkable discoveries, but it is also built upon ordinary people carrying out extraordinary responsibilities. Lighthouse keepers belonged to that tradition. Their work demanded patience rather than applause, consistency rather than excitement, responsibility rather than recognition. The Flannan Isles remind us of that forgotten world, a world where silence filled the evenings, where weather shaped every decision, where isolation became part of everyday life. Modern technology has changed nearly everything about navigation. Satellites guide ships across oceans. Weather forecasts arrive instantly. Automatic systems monitor coastlines day and night. The dangers have not disappeared completely, but people understand them far better than they did in 1900. Even so, the sea continues teaching the same lesson. Respect cannot be replaced by technology. Preparation remains essential. Nature always deserves humility. That lesson has never grown old. Visitors who reach the Flannan Isles today often leave with memories very different from those they expected. Many arrive searching for mystery. Instead, they discover peace. The island is quiet. The air is clean. The horizon seems endless. Standing beside the lighthouse, it becomes surprisingly easy to forget the noise of the modern world. There are no crowded streets, no constant traffic, only birds, wind, waves, and sky. Perhaps that peaceful silence explains why the story has become such a comforting one, despite its unanswered questions. It invites reflection rather than fear. The mystery itself remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will. No new witness is likely to appear. No forgotten journal will suddenly reveal every detail. The Atlantic has guarded its secrets for more than 100 years. History has learned to accept that. Accepting uncertainty is not the same as giving up. It is simply recognizing the limits of what evidence can tell us. That honesty is one of history's greatest strengths. Rather than inventing impossible explanations, careful historians allow the facts to speak quietly for themselves. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers disappeared. Storm damage existed near the western landing. The sea was powerful. The evidence ended there. Everything beyond those facts becomes thoughtful interpretation rather than certainty. In many ways, that makes the story even more meaningful. It reminds us that history is not a collection of perfect answers. It is an ongoing conversation between evidence, memory, and careful observation. Sometimes the conversation reaches a clear conclusion. Sometimes it ends with respectful silence. The Flannan Isles belong to that second kind of story, and perhaps that is exactly where they should remain. As our own quiet journey comes to an end, imagine standing one final time beside the lighthouse.
The night air feels cool against your face. The steady beam turns slowly above your head. Far below, the Atlantic continues its endless rhythm, wave after wave, just as it has for countless generations. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another ship safely follows that light through the darkness. The lighthouse has fulfilled its purpose once again. The men who once cared for it are gone, but their work continues through the enduring legacy they helped create. Their final moments may never be fully known. Their story may never receive a perfect ending. Yet their dedication, their quiet courage, and their commitment to protecting others remain unmistakably clear. As the stars shine over the lonely islands and the waves whisper gently against the ancient cliffs, the Flannan Islands return to their timeless silence. The lighthouse keeps watch. The ocean continues its endless journey, and history, with all its unanswered questions, rests peacefully beneath the northern sky. Good night.